G'day, Newcastle stand-up writers group. I thought I'd post a video here on some comedy theory for you. These are just some thoughts that I've been compiling myself anyway, into something of like a training module just for my own thoughts. So I figured, what the hell, I may as well share it with you, mob. So I call my theory of comedy writing, is called the MES theory. Um, that I believe that the best way to view comedy writing, or the best way to gauge how and why an audience responds to your jokes, is a triangulation of three primary factors. Now, I'll bring up here on the screen a little triangular chart here so that you can see what those three factors are. So if you can see here, we've got like a triangle. At the top, I've got material. We've also got sentiment and expression. Now, what I'd like to do in this comedy session is I'm going to focus on, well, I'll explain the whole triangular theories in a broader sense, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the expression side of it. Because I tend to think this is especially what is lacking, particularly in new comedians, but also what's lacking generally across the board of the comedy industry. And there's some historical reasons for that, which I can get into too. So if we're having a look here at the triangle, at the top we've got material. Now, material is script, the words that you're using in your jokes, in your routines. Okay. The expression aspect of it is how you say that, how you deliver that material, what you're doing with your voice, with your body language, etc. And then sentiment is it's sort of like that, that Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon triangular motif, how you've got the light comes in and then refracts. That the sentiment aspect of this is an intersection between two different elements of sentiment. There's the sentiment that you're conveying with your material and with your expression, and then that gets refracted through the sentiment that the audience carries. Okay, then. So let's zoom in now on this the peak of this triangle, the writing. Now, the words that you use to create humor or a joke, I think what you should do in your mind, I believe, and this is something that you should audit your material. Like if you write down like a list of all your jokes, or the script of all your jokes, uh, it's a good habit to get into for you to categorize your material into two halves. Is what you're saying a literal joke, meaning with a punchline, or is it just a humorous sentiment? Yeah. If you understand the difference between humor and a joke, right, you need to audit your own material, because you absolutely need to understand what material you're using that is more likely to be successful, and what is more likely to be less successful, and in certain circumstances, in certain gigs. Now, like if you're if you're in a situation where you've got a crowd that's only half warmed up, it hasn't really, it's just like a bit of a dull vibe on the night. There's no great excitement in the crowd. Maybe the MC hasn't managed to win them over at the start of the gig, or maybe there's something in the atmosphere. It's a blue moon. People are a bit like down in the dumps or whatever. The interest rates went up that day. Yeah, they're more likely to respond only and exclusively to jokes with punchlines. Jokes with punchlines are always going to be stronger. Now, when a gig is going better, the audience will start come on board and laugh at what is not technically a joke, but is just a humorous sentiment. Okay, so understand what constitutes a joke, what constitutes a punchline. You know, a punchline is something that has a twist, something that you fooled the audience. You've made the audience think you're going in this direction, but then you spin it around in this direction. Yeah, you've made the audience presume something of great fortune is going to happen, but then it's revealed that that's actually a great misfortune. It's a play on words, double entendre, right? So something that you know, flips around something inside the head of the audience that gives a surprise element. Bam, that's a punchline. Okay. Um, Humor is something that it's something funny to think about. It's something that makes you smile, something that makes you smirk, but it doesn't necessarily have that punch, that element of surprise or twist at the end of the story. Okay, so go and audit your own material. Like put P or H between, you know, punchline or humor. Understand which aspects of your which parts of the catalog in your material actually constitute punchlines and what's just humor, right? And if you find that you've got too much just plain humor and not enough punchlines, then you know there's going to be a lot of gigs where you're going to be in trouble there. Yeah, you're going to be struggling. And this sort of also it helps you understand why on some nights some material does better, and you know why some, like on a night where an audience is really warm and they're laughing at anything you do, they're laughing at just the humor and not just the punchlines. Okay, so it's good for you to have an appreciation of that distinction and how that's going to play out with different audiences. Okay. All right then. So look, the next moving on to the next part of the triangle, we're looking at expression now. Expression is how you deliver your material. Now, when you think about the most successful comedians at your local comedy club, and when you think about the most successful routines that they use, they will typically, almost exclusively, they will be the comedy routines that involve some aspect or element of physicality, right? The more exuberant they are, the more they have to act out things, the more body language or gesticulation they bring into their act, into their routine, the funnier and punchier and more reliable it tends to be. Okay. Now, especially when you think about absolute world-class comedians like Robin Williams or Jim Carrey. I grew up loving Kenny Everett, the British comedian. He was extremely physical, very expressive. It's that wildly expressive aspect that really distinguishes the absolute top-class comedians, and that expression endears you to an audience. It's certainly a lot more entertaining to be watching a comedian who's bouncing around the stage using their full power of expression, their full body, rather than just standing there at a microphone and saying stuff. That said, look, comedy also, one of the funny things about comedy is that it can be contrary. So obviously, and yes, there are some comedians who are extremely understated, and in exaggerating their understatement, they pull laughs out of an audience. Okay, but when we think about expressiveness in this context, what I'd like you to think about is all the things that can add to the entertainment of your material that are not word-based. So the list that I have here, at the most basic level, your timing, your comedic timing. That's part of your power of expression. So too is like your imitation, impersonation, doing impressions, gesture, gesticulation. I'd include things like mimicry, musical accompaniment. If you're bringing up a guitar or a drum or a harmonica or whatever. Body language, using sound effects. Yeah, using an accent, using as in a foreign accent, using a tonality of voice. Props. Now you've always got a prop with you at a comedy room because you've got a microphone and a microphone stand. It's always good for you to work on having at least one joke that involves pretending that your mic stand is something else, or pretending that the microphone is some alternative object. Um, Puppets is also another means of expression. So that, I think that pretty much exhausts the list. Oh yeah, also things like juggling, balloons, bubbles, mixed media. These are also additional things. Now, I'll do a little divergence into comedy history here. Comedy history. So look, comedy started off as court jesters and bards going around singing funny ditties in pubs and things like that. Court jesters obviously had a very physical aspect to their comedy, goofing off, playing the fool, being the fall guy. Um, Stand-up comedy as a subgenre of art typically is understood as having begun around about the sort of mid 1800s. Mark Twain is regarded by some as being sort of the first stand-up comedian. He was an American political satirist who did speaking tours, and he was renowned for making his audience laugh on those speaking tours. And then people kind of started getting the idea, hang on, instead of going to an audience to impress them that what you say is important, you can actually just go to an audience and make them laugh. Um, so this sort of like was the spoken word aspect. Obviously, you had, prior to that, you had theatrical based comedy. Shakespeare did comedies, pantomimes are intended to make kids laugh. But in terms of just standing there and speaking words and speaking your mind and making observations, so that sort of started in the mid 1800s. Then it took a divergence away from stand up and speaking because of the advent of the film industry. In its original inception, didn't have the audio technology. So the first films were the silent film genre and era. So you had your Charlie Chaplins and your Buster Keatons. So they sort of dominated 1910, 1920, and it was only sort of the early mid 1930s that audio recording started to come into the film industry and reinsert the focus on spoken word as being the trigger point for laughter. But when stand-up comedy, so through the Second World War or post-war period into the 50s and 60s, most stand-up comedians were still fairly physical because of that heritage of theatre-based comedy, physical-based comedy, um, and when, and this was still kind of the case like in the late 80s, early 90s when I first started becoming a comedian. There weren't a great deal many stand-up comedy venues around. And typically when you came into it, you came from a background of theatre or street theatre or, doing pantomimes with your local church group. So it was still a very physical sort of medium. And like when I started stand-up comedy in the early 1990s, if you had, say, like 10 acts, on average, 3 or 4 of those acts would be a musical accompaniment or a double act or an impersonator or someone who's bringing up a puppet. Like typically these days, that's really diminished. You can take any 10 acts on a comedy night and maybe only one of them will be doing some kind of musical accompaniment or bringing some other element, some other more theatrical element into their stand-up comedy. So a lot more people are just doing straight, I'm standing here with a microphone and that's all I do sort of thing. Now, a lot of that is also historically to do with the refocus, say, of the education system. Like if you went to school in the 1970s or 1980s, if you did a drama class, they'd be preparing you for a life in theatre, not necessarily a life in TV or movies. But from the sort of like mid 80s onwards, if you did drama class in your high school, for example, they'll be preparing you for a life on screen. In preparing you for a life on screen, you have to underact. Yeah, the camera picks up everything and magnifies everything. So yeah, you've got your classic, like I'm always taking the piss out of Ryan Gosling as to how little he does with his face. Um, so, and that's what teachers are preparing you for now. They're not teaching you to like mug your face like Jim Carrey, because that looks ridiculous on a screen, especially on a big screen. And kids going through high school these days, they all want to be TV stars or movie stars. Yeah. So, I think that was one of the main reasons that, like, as the decades have gone on, less and less stand-up comedians have been bringing theatrical and very expressive and very physical elements to their comedy. And that's, to my mind, that's a shame and that's a loss. And I think you'd do well as a comedian to try and correct that or work against that, and do as much as you can to bring uh, expressive and physical elements into your comedy. Okay, so thanks for indulging that little divergence into history. Now we'll come back to the triangle, to the third part of the triangle that we haven't examined yet, and that's sentiment. Okay, so in your comedy material, you are conveying certain sentiments. With your power of expression, you are also augmenting certain sentiments, and sometimes they can work in harmony with each other, or sometimes you can even like be in opposing directions. Like you can use some body language which tells the audience that you're bullshitting with the sentiment you're using in your language. Okay, but the sentiment that your joke is conveying meets in the middle with the sentiment of the audience and how the audience gauges sentiment. Okay, when you're in front of an audience, that audience is always passing through their mind, making generally subconscious, for the most part, judgments. They're judging you on things like, how likable or unlikable are you? How relatable or unrelatable are you? Uh, are you being socially appropriate or inappropriate? Um, uh, is what you're doing admirable or dishonorable? So that they're forming all these judgments of you, and then filtering that through your jokes, your comedy, your expression, the sentiment that's coming at them from your comedy, and where those two meet in the middle will determine the strength or the power of laughter or lack thereof that you experience. Okay. Now, so if you think about some comedians, so like if you take Jim Owen, the famous Irish Australian comedian, he was enormously likable. Okay, so because he rated really high on the likability, uh, and yeah, his accent, his Irish accent, lended into that. His sort of goofball expression. Um, he was enormously likable, and so audiences would respond like they'd be more generous in laughing at maybe a kind of a lame joke because he was high on likability. Okay. Um, Same too with other traits like your relatability. You don't have to rate high in all of these things, right? So sometimes you can, and once again, comedy is a contrary thing. If and with certain things, if you rate really, really super low in these traits that the audience are judging, sometimes it flips around and becomes an asset, right? What comes to mind is like there's an Australian act in the early 1990s on the ABC's Big Gig show. The act is called Flacco, Flacco. Go watch some videos of Flacco. Kind of likable, utterly unrelatable. He played this weird kind of alien character. You can't relate to him at all, but he was so unrelatable that it becomes funny again. Um, but yeah, like if you're doing a joke which is like particularly vulgar, for example, your audience might, depending on the audience you're in front of, their sentiment towards vulgarity will strongly influence how well they receive that joke. This can be affected by things like class. If you're working in a like a scruffy working man's pub filled with yellow shirt guys, then your vulgarity um, will be received favourably. If you're in a posh la-di-da um, gala type event, they might not be so favourable to that vulgarity. Except, and this is the funny thing about culture. So, if in upper class society you can be vulgar if you're doing vulgarity for that's pro gay and pro lesbian because la di da aspirational people like, oh yes, we're very woke, oh yes, we're very understanding and open minded, so of course we'll laugh at this, ha ha ha, right? Whereas if you came on there and did an equally vulgar joke but concerning heterosexual male sexuality, then it's, oh no, we don't laugh at that sort of thing here. No, we're posh people, So that whole interplay of culture, society, sociology, interplaying with psychology, that all feeds into sentiment and in how they meet and respond to the sentiment that's coming from your comedy. Okay, so that's the basics of this MES comedy theory triangle that I operate from. So what I'll do now is I'll talk about the creativity or how to train or gear your creativity towards making more expressive comedy. Um, the the importance of it, of having more expressive comedy, I find, is uh, how it connects to sentiment. It makes you more likable. When you're doing physical comedy, you're being playful, which is a different thing from being funny, right? I mean, you can be this kind of style of comedian who just stands there with a microphone and you don't do much physical activity, and you can still be a great comedian that way. That comedy tends, like, if you got really clever punchlines, the audience will still read that as admirable, but not necessarily likable or endearing, right? The more physically playful you are, the more endearing it is to an audience. It reminds you of bit of your childhood when people are capering, when you're pretending, right? This is one of the things that is really a very strong element of comedy. When you're pretending to be something, is a very powerful trigger for people's laughter and emotion and your likability as assessed by the audience. Okay, so how do we as a comedian gear our creativity towards becoming more expressive, more physical comedians? First thing to appreciate is that this is a matter of your willpower. You can do it. uh, you can look at acts like Lano and Woodley or the Empty Pockets, who will do an entire 1 hour show of physical comedy between them. UK duo Adrian Edmonds and Rick Mail were very good at this too. So if these guys can pull out an entire show which is physical comedy interplay between each other, then obviously they've geared their creativity towards that aim, towards that endeavor, rather than just like randomly striking upon things that are funny, then writing them down, then sharing them, right? So you can tell yourself what kind of comedy you want to create. Now, if you're going to direct your creative energies into creating more physical comedy, then what you should do is appreciate where that creativity comes from, and understand the different compartments of our imagination. Now, typically, I think of the word imagination as having a sort of a sensory bias, and that's built into the actual language. Imagination, image, that presupposes that you are seeing something in your mind's eye, okay? But when a musician thinks of a new melody, they're using what you could call ordination, the imagination of their ears, right? So too when you're creating language, you're using ordination to think up new permutations of words that combine to hopefully convey some funny or humorous sentiment. Okay, but your other senses also have an imagination. You can sit there reading a menu and like at a posh restaurant, and you'll read some fabulous combination of ingredients on a dessert, and your mouth might water. Your mouth is using its imagination, right? Or its olfactination, if you want to call it that. Okay, but you also have a kinesthesia, touch, the sensation of your body. Your kinesthesia is what you need to engage to create physical comedy. Now, you use your kinesthesia in a passive sense when, as I'm doing now, when I'm talking, using my hands, right? Your kinesthesia is what delivers up choices or suggestions of your body language, okay? I have a kinesthetic sort of response in a negative horror kind of sense. If I see someone getting injured, for some weird reason, this only happens below the waist. If I see someone getting an injury on their leg, I feel that energy, that really yucky, horrible energy in my leg where they've experienced the injury, like if it's a skinned knee or whatever. Like, I feel that. Like, funnily enough, though, it doesn't happen from the waist up. Like, you can get a fucking spear through your chest, I won't feel anything there. But if you've got a spear through your leg, I get this weird fucking feeling in my leg. It's bizarre. So kinesthesia is what you need to engage in order to come up with gestures and gesticulation and mimicry and pretending to be things, okay? And this is where your improv comes in. So sources where you can, or activities that you can do to engage your kinesthesia, go to an improv class. Sign up for improv class. If you've never done them, you absolutely should. I love doing pantomime, like children's theatre. That's a very free form of expression. It's a type of acting where the director is hoping to God that you overact, because that triggers the kids and the kids laugh. It's not a restricted form of theatre where everyone's trying to, being posh and trying to be a good actor or whatever. You're just mucking around, right? Street theatre, go and check out street theatre or attempt to do street theatre is another good way. But the most easily accessible thing for you to do to engage your kinesthesia is to, when you're rehearsing at home in a private space, overact, okay? And when I say overact, I mean overact to the absolute maximum, okay? When you're rehearsing your material, like, pretend to yourself that you are in an outdoor amphitheater and your closest audience member is half a kilometer away, right? Force yourself to act out with the most expansive gesture possible to convey to the far distant people what you're on about with your material. Now, the reason you do that isn't necessarily that that's what you're going to bring to the stage when you perform your act at the comedy club. The point of it is to engage the imagination of your body so that your body disgorges physical activities and suggestions, right? So you'll be like, you've got a script, you've got a joke, you've got a routine, you've got it written down. When you act it out, when you overact it out, you'll find that you'll be doing something, and then suddenly your body will kind of mimic some body language or mimic an activity that coincides with your material, right? So this isn't the imagination or your ordination. You haven't thought to do this. Your body will suggest it. Your body will come up with it independently of your conscious thought, of the words in your head, okay? And that's where you can really like grab and then lock in. Oh wow, hang on, that works. That's really expressive. That really conveys, you know, what I'm trying to do, or exaggerates what I'm banging on about, and it's very playful and engaging. Okay. All right then. So now the other aspect of creating more physical comedy is to regard physical actions, gestures as topics, right? You know, when you're thinking about your comedy material, when you're thinking about your jokes, you think in terms of topics, right? You think, oh, I've got a joke about blowjobs. Oh, hey, Carl, have you got a joke about the church? Oh, yeah, I've got this material about the church, or this material about interest rates, or whatever. So we sort of categorize them, or tag them. Okay, like when you've got your short list of comedy material that you're going to deliver on stage, you'll typically just have like one word which triggers the entire joke in your memory, and we typically write on the in terms of like the topic. Okay, think about physical gestures in terms of topics. Okay, like someone sticking their tongue out, that's a topic. Okay, someone doing the New Zealand rugby haka, that's a topic. Okay, you might observe someone walking in a particular way with a particular gait that people only use to convey a certain disposition. It's only used in certain circumstances. Bang, tag that. Okay, so regard them as topics, as categories, and then you can sort of insert them. You can either work on them to be a comedy device or vehicle in and of themselves, or they're sitting there on a shelf, on a creative shelf for you to sort of like insert in the middle of other material. Okay, so that's physical comedy. The other primary plank of being expressive is character work. Uh, when you've got your script, never cease in your rehearsal the process of trying to be more expressive with the same material. And you should always assess your material to see if and where you can slip in some character work. Now, it doesn't have to be a great lengthy character piece impersonation. Just from phrase to phrase, you can slip into and drop into character. Like, for example, why say "Where's me doll money" when you could say "Where's me fucking doll money"? Yeah. Why say "I'm aspirational" when you could say "Darling, I'm aspirational"? You know, there's always some kind of character that you can slip into. It's very good for audience interaction. If you are talking to an audience member responds to you, you can just drop into character and pretend to be the audience member. And all you have to do is paraphrase what they're saying back to you. Just the mere fact of you slipping into character, into that pretense, into pretending, is enough to get a rise out of an audience. The greatest person to study for this, of course, the late great Robin Williams. Watch him in interviews, like on David Letterman or whatever. He'll just mid-interview drop into character, improvising some dialogue or monologue, and then move from one character to another character, in the same breath. Enjoy your character work. It also makes your performance more fun for you to do, and this is the great thing about being an expressive comedian. When it comes to doing the physical comedy, when it comes to slipping into character halfway through a comedy routine, it's always more fun and engaging for yourself. And of course, you having more fun is going to be received and reflected by the audience. All right. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I hope you've enjoyed this. Hope you've gotten something out of it. I'll see you around the comedy club.